Okay, Tyler, I do have some tobacco for you. So before I forget, I just wanted to introduce this expression of gratitude for the time that you're taking today to share your knowledge with all of us. So thank you so much.
Awesome, miigwech. Yeah, ani bojo kinawea uzawa ng indigenous cause Anishinaabe kwendao kitakans min don kwano to them. So yeah, Daniel and I are here today to tell you a little bit about we prior to the beginning of our talks, Daniel and I went on walks around North York, down by the down by two of the rivers that run through that area. Myself being an Indigenous youth, and Daniel as someone who has a lot of the kind of like structural or knowledge of like North York and like what that the implications of that has. We do welcome any questions throughout. We very much want this session to be a conversation that Daniel and I are leading rather than like both of us kind of talking at yous. And so introducing myself, I'm Shari Sewell, I'm Anishinaabe. I'm a writer. I have 4 younger siblings. My family comes from Garden River First Nation, which is up past Sudbury. I grew up in Hamilton, and I'm currently living in Brantford. So when I first joined this project, I was like, oh, cool, like it sounds interesting. I've never worked with an organization in Toronto. So that was what kind of drew me in. And then as we started working and as I started getting to know Daniel, it was interesting that the both of us, myself, like not being Indigenous to these lands, but having grown up here and having grown up like in community with folks who are from like this territory. And then Daniel also, and I'll have him, he can share a bit more about it later, but also not being from these lands and having a unique relationship with it. So I think as we go through today, I'd just like to encourage folks to also think about like how they're coming to these lands and what the relationship that they have with your homelands or the homelands of your ancestors and how that kind of translates into your relationship with the lands that you're living on now. So yeah, Daniel, if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thanks, Skylar. So I'm Daniel Rothstein. My last name is hard to spell, and there's a variety of pronunciations, but it kind of comes from, I've realized that it's a Yiddish last name with a Polish spelling. So it's kind of like a Germanic word, but with a Polish spelling, and it means redstone. And my mother's name is Greenholtz, which means Greenwood. So my name is Daniel Greenwood Redstone, and I feel like as a geographer, it's nice to see that there's some kind of lineage there in terms of like a land-based practice for, maybe it was bricklaying and cutting wood logs, but and I really appreciate in Indigenous spaces, people kind of introducing themselves and their totem and where they're from. And I, just am inspired by that practice. And I think as a settler in this land, like kind of situating myself as my version of that. And I've been thinking a lot about my family history recently. I went to a family wedding in Calgary. So I saw a bunch of like long lost relatives. And so my grandparents are all from southern Poland, what's southern Poland today, and they all were refugees after World War II, and they moved to Winnipeg. My mom's grandparents moved to Winnipeg, and my dad's parents moved to Montreal, and then my mom and dad moved to Toronto for economic opportunities, and that's where they met and raised their family, including me and my siblings. And so I'm like a first generation Torontonian, and I like to say that there's like intergenerational trauma for sure, but I'm also feeling intergenerational exhaustion. And after like so much movement and displacement and, just being kind of roaming around, I find myself in the land that Toronto is on now. And I find myself incredibly grateful to be here and wanting to put down roots and not feeling any, disruption, and there being a welcoming energy to this land. And part of that is understanding relationships to the land, relationships to the indigenous peoples of this land, to the treaties. And so I've made it, a lot of my work to understand those histories and, not shy away from is an often tough conversation because it's rooted in, as we've learned throughout these sessions, so violence and mistrust and things are repairing in small ways now, but there's a role for settlers to have in this conversation. And I appreciate all my teachers and friends who have welcomed me into this conversation and, not made too much fun of me when I get things wrong. So that's me in a general sense. And I'm an artist, writer, and cartographer, as Julian introduced, and kind of understanding this place in its deep histories is part of my practice. So it was really nice to be with Schuyler and kind of recognize that, we're both not from this land in particular, and I'm maybe more removed than Schuyler is, and because of racial inequity and colonization, I have this really close relationship to this place and have a canoe and know the names of plants when that isn't accessible to everyone. So a lot of what I think about is democratizing that knowledge and not making it specialized, and having a chance to just walk the land with a collaborator is such a pleasure. So I'll hand it back over to Schuyler.
Awesome, thank you so much. Yeah, so before we get into it, I'd just like to do a little, visualization exercise, just a way for us to kind of think about our bodies and then also think about the direction that we'll be taking this conversation in. So Daniel, since you're the only other one who doesn't have your video off, I'll invite you to turn your video off, and then I'll also turn mine off, and these will just be hearing my voice and maybe also the water that's running in the kitchen. But I'd just like to invite folks to get comfortable in your seats, or if you're standing, I'd like to invite folks to just move around so that they feel comfortable in their body. I'd also like to invite folks to place your feet flat on the ground, wherever you are. And of course, if it's not something that you're comfortable doing, then throughout all of this, just do whatever feels most comfortable to you. But if you are able and would like to put your feet flat on the ground, I really invite you to. Your feet are very important. They bring you around, they carry you around wherever you go, and they also act as a way for you to physically connect to the land. They're the first point of contact for you to the lands that you live on. And so having your feet on the ground, and take a deep breath in and out. Your breath connects you to the world around you, and the air that you breathe is also the air that has been breathed from trees and such. So it's everything about the way that the human body is also a connection to the land around you. So as folks get comfortable in their seats, I'd just like you to wiggle your toes, wiggle your fingers, maybe roll your shoulders. And relax into your chair. And as you start relaxing, don't forget to breathe. Think about water. Think about the way that water sounds, way that water looks when the sun hits it, how it feels when it hugs your body, how it feels when it comes down from the sky and hits your nose. Is there a body of water that you feel especially connected to? Is this body of water one that you've grown up around, or is it one that you just like to come to because it's close by where you live? Or do your people have stories about this water? Think about this body of water and take a deep breath again. Think about the way that water smells when it's fresh or when you smell it on the air after a rainfall. And thinking back to that body of water, how do you get there? Does it take a long time to walk? Maybe do you bike? Do you think about the travel when you're doing it, or do you just think, I'm just going to the water and that's it? And as you're relaxing in your chair and taking deep breaths, I'd like you to imagine being on that waterfront. Feel the cooler air on your face, on your arms, on your legs. The weather's getting warmer, so we can wear shorts outside again. Think about your feet on the ground beside the water. Maybe think about your feet in the water. How does it feel when you're by this body of water? Does it feel safe, calming? Does it fuel you with creativity? And as you're imagining being in this space, I'd just like to invite folks to say thank you to the water. Imagine this body of water in your mind vividly and say thank you to it, because water has offered us so much. And after you say thank you, also say see you later, because you will see this body of water again. And after today's session, if you're able, I encourage you to go out for a walk and connect with the land and the water. And take a deep breath again. And as you're breathing out, start wiggling your toes and your fingers again. Feel your body in the chair. How do your legs feel against the seat? How does your back feel against the backrest? How do your feet feel flat on the floor? Can you feel the land beneath you, or do you just feel the land in the building? And if you do, then the land, the earth, and the dirt is beneath that. And so you're connected as well. So as you're coming back to your body, I'd like to invite folks to gently open their eyes and take a look around, to let the light flow in. And once you're ready, I invite folks back to the Zoom room. So I just wanted to do that exercise as a way to get folks to kind of connect with their bodies, think about their bodies, and also like remember the water and think about it, because we can't be together physically outside. So that's as close as I can imagine bringing, as close as I can try to bring you. So yeah, so getting closer or more into our story of the walk. So I currently live in Brantford, and getting to Toronto from Brantford is not as easy as getting from Hamilton to Brantford. Whereas Hamilton is like one bus, Brantford is either like a bus and then a train, or one train that's kind of more expensive than regular trains. And so for me, it was also my first time traveling to Toronto alone to do this project. So it was exciting, but also very nerve-wracking, and what felt like a lot of travel. So I had to travel a lot. Daniel had to travel. And then we both had to travel to North York, which was like interesting in itself. And I think for both of us, it became very clear early on that movement would be a big theme in what we learn and what we talk about. So Daniel and I both met. We had kind of talked on the phone before meeting in person, but we both met at Union Station in person for the first time, and we walked past each other because we were looking for each other. We had seen each other on Zoom, but nothing else. So we passed each other. I remember Daniel walking past me, and we shared a look that was kind of like, "Are you the person I'm looking for?" But we didn't say anything. And then Daniel walked past. He called me, and we were like, "Yes, we are the people we were looking for." So that was a funny moment, a funny way that like we kind of like became acquainted in real life, and what an experience it was too, after like being and still kind of coming out of a pandemic. So with that beginning, I'll pass on to Daniel to continue on. Yeah.
Thanks, Chandler. Yeah, this was earlier. It was cold out, and yeah, just since the pandemic has made us, of course, I see my friends and some of my other friends, but then meeting new people. So this was quite an opportunity to meet somebody I hadn't met before and collaborate with them. But yeah, like I said, I grew up in the city and know it very well. So I was like, Schuyler, let's take transit. It will be easy for us to get to the water. I mean, we were close to Lake Ontario, but our goal was to get to the Don River, what's now known as the Don River. And it was a classic day for Toronto when there was a disruption in the subway and there was a bus. So we had to take a subway to a bus to a subway to a subway to a bus. I think to a subway, and then then we took a walk down to the water, and so it was just kind of like that absurdity. I think like the world was like, okay, you want to find water, we're like, let's demonstrate to you that it's challenging in this time. But water is life, as we know, and water is the reason that people are on this land here, and have been so for millennia. And thinking about what Toronto was like before colonization, and like often I'll go to Rouge Park in the east, and it's kind of like a vision of the city before it was paved over, and you kind of get a sense of the wildness and the lack of kind of linear logic that existed here before. So today, Toronto is characterized by three major river systems: the Humber in the west, the Don in the middle, and the Rouge in the east. Those are, of course, newer names for very ancient waterways. But before urbanization and colonization, this land would have been like crisscrossed with rivers and streams and creeks and whatever word you want to use to describe water flowing through land. And some of them were very large, like what's now known as the Don, and some of them were seasonal, like that, during spring flooding, it would always be in the same place, and slowly it would develop into a more pronounced river. And some of them were just, 1 year, little, water flowing and then gone. But then, as Europeans moved here and wanted to develop the land and wanted to make it arable and wanted to make it sellable, a lot of those rivers were annihilated. A lot of those creeks were annihilated. The most famous one is Garrison Creek, which was quite large. It was navigable up to Bloor Street, like you could take a boat up there. And the ravine that was in kind of became a bit of a dump. And it was decided as a cleanliness to put it into a brick pipe, and it's still a sewer system today. And if on a really rainy day, you can listen for the Garrison Creek still rushing. So the water still exists. And as we know, when there are heavy rains and there's flooding, that's the Garrison Creek kind of saying, hello, like still here. And so what we have today, the remnants of these water systems, is just like an echo of what was here before, and represents a lot of control over the land. But water still plays a huge role in why we're here. So there's so much to say. Humans are attracted to water. you know, the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and all the nations that lived here before, of course, would follow water trails and fresh water as a vital resource. And then the settlers put mills and dams on the water because that's where industry could be. And there's always this like desire to be as close to the water as possible. So why in Toronto is so much away from the water? It's almost like the city is on one level and then the ravines are below and the water is completely disconnected. And that's because in 1958, there was a big hurricane called Hurricane Hazel, and it's made all the rivers, which we typically see as like not that powerful, not that strong, just little creeks that we can cross on a summer day. All those became really flooded and many people died. And the provincial government decided that nobody is going to live by the water anymore. It's not safe. There are these 100-year flood events. And so that's when we kind of like officially lost our connection to the water. You know, it was a long process, but that was a big one. So the city kind of went up to the street level and the ravines were like kind of left alone. And there were, you know, people said, okay, they're natural spaces, humans shouldn't be there, let's just leave them alone. Another phenomenon is that the grid that we all know Toronto for was drawn up in England by, you know, the British administration, and they drew the grid of Toronto and they didn't really know what the land was like here. Just it was abstract, and they said, oh, it's just flat land, let's just draw a grid. So they imposed that grid onto this very variable terrain. And at first, a lot of the roads, even if the survey was drawn in a straight line across a ravine, we didn't have the technology to build giant bridges. So, you know, there were roads that went down to the ravine and then back up. So there was still kind of a connective quality there. But then in the 50s and 60s, we could build these giant concrete bridges. And so that's why often if you navigate Toronto, you'll find like Old Dundas, Old Yonge, Old this, Old that. And that's the old designation is kind of the one that was a little more intimate with the land and the landscape. And the new one is the one that retains that grid. And you could be driving through the city and never know that you were passing over water. So I like to, whenever, if you're driving with me, if you ever go on a road trip, I'll always say, we're on the Humber River. Like if we're on the 401, I'll always point out the water because I think it's just so important to connect with that moment. Yeah, so let me go back to my notes here. I got off track. Yeah, so I wanted, we're keeping it mostly conversational, but Shyler knows I'm a very visual person and I couldn't resist sharing some slides. Not so much a slide as our Miro board. And if for those of you who haven't used Miro, it's the best. So here we have, you know, this red is North York, and this is a map of Toronto. And of course, this doesn't exist because the water, here's Lake Ontario below, and it's surrounded by land. But this is kind of the city of Toronto as we know it. And North York was a city that was an independent city until recently, until 1998. Before 1998, Toronto was made up of 6 independent cities. We had Old Toronto here, Etobicoke, Scarborough, York, East York, and North York. So that's kind of why we call it the 6, because it was the original 6 municipalities. And I know there's 6 nations, which was the original 6, but this was before Drake, there was the 6 municipalities in Metro Toronto. So North York is this boundary, and you can see Etobicoke is actually marked by the Humber. So that is kind of like a logical boundary, but a lot of it is just lines, and these lines are just those arbitrary lines drawn over the landscape. This is Victoria Park that marks Scarborough here, and this is Steeles Avenue that marks the boundary between Vaughan and Toronto. And you know, we have the rivers, and the rivers don't care where these artificial boundaries are. They are, you know, the water flows north of North York, it flows south of North York, and it flows right into Lake Ontario. And so there's an arbitrary designation to this as North York. But, you know, over time we draw lines and the lines affect us. And also there's something to say that like North York is kind of halfway between the sources of these rivers, which is what's known as the Oak Ridges Moraine. A moraine is kind of like when the glaciers were here and they were melting, there were parts of the glaciers that like water was slooshing around, and all the earth there was kind of unconsolidated gravel and pieces of earth, and a lot of water is stored in land like that, and that's the source of many of these rivers. So there's rivers that go north toward Lake Simcoe and south toward Lake Ontario. So back to North York here. This is kind of like the in-between the sources of the river and their destination, which is the lake, which is of course not their final destination, but it was a way of thinking about North York as kind of the middle reaches of these rivers. Like that was kind of like an honest land-based connection. Like, you know, there's the lake effect when you're by the lake, as Schuyler invoked in her meditation. It's cooler. There's, you know, you can sense that you're by this inland sea. But when you're up in these higher lands in North York, it's a totally different quality. So I think there's something to be said about these middle reaches being, you know, an important experience of what North York is. Schuyler, should I pass it to you or should I say more things?
You can go on to say a little bit more if you'd
Okay,
like.
I'll just finish with maybe, you know, what we know the original names of these rivers to be. So the Don River and the Humber, these are, you know, names from Yorkshire, which a lot of the original British people who came and colonized this land came from Yorkshire. So there's a Don River in Yorkshire. I believe there's a Humber River in Yorkshire. So the inclination to name things after a place you miss, but, you know, also missing the point, which is that these places have their own histories and names. So the Don was known as in Anishinaabe-Moan, the Wanscontenash River, which translates to something like burning bright point. And I think John Johnson, who does First Story Toronto, for trying to teach me the pronunciation, and of course I'm probably butchering it, but he's not here, so I'll ask him again later. But burning bright point might refer to the practice of controlled burns up in the upper forests of the Don. Or it might refer to the practice of fishing salmon by torch spear. So burning bright point. And a friend of mine actually, so there's a kind of a movement to rename the river from the Don to Wanscontenash. And my friend said, why don't we just call it the Wan? So it's kind of like in between the Don and Wanscontenash. And it's like maybe a step, get people used to this old name and then go all the way. And then this other river known as the Humber today, a name for it had been Kobachenok, which I've been taught means leave the canoes and go back. And that is to refer to the fact that this is the Humber is the route of the Toronto Carrying Place Trail, which I'll get into a little bit later. And the Carrying Place Trail was a walking trail because the Humber was not quite navigable by boat because there was all kind of flats and shallows and changes in elevation. So you kind of left your canoes and you did your walking trail, or maybe there were periods of the trail where you canoed, but then you stopped and then you walked. And that trail led all the way to Lake Simcoe, what's now known as Lake Simcoe. And just a quick why Toronto is called Toronto. Between the narrows of Lake Simcoe and Couchiching was Takaronto, which is a Haudenosaunee word for fishing weirs. And they still exist. They're like petrified at the bottom of the narrows between Lake Couchiching and Lake Simcoe, like a very important site for this region. So that was referred to as Takaronto, which Niall, I worked at with the Brickworks, Magiza, he told me that there was kind of like emotion associated with that word, like Takaronto was like spearing the fish. But then that zone was known as Takaronto, and then the trail was known as the Takaronto Trail, and then that word kind of followed the trail down to what we now know as Toronto. And I'll pass it over to Schuyler.
Awesome. Thank you for that perfect segue. So I'm gonna, so I had shared a little bit earlier about how like movement was a big theme for us, and like we kind of established that early on. So we after taking all of these subways and buses to try and get to the water, we'd finally gotten to the water, and we were walking along this concrete pathway. And one of the first things we talked about, because it's something that I always try to think about, is like my language, and how do I think about my language, like while also kind of like living in like Mohawk or some Mohawk territory, and then or Haudenosaunee territory, and also like living in the city and not really having access to learn my language. So anytime I kind of get to think about my language or talk about it, I do, and this was one of those chances. So one of the first things that I had shared with Daniel was about how Anishinaabemowin is a language that focuses on and kind of uses verbs as like the way to conjugate, or like verbs are like the center, I guess, of this language. And so what an interesting language it is, because it when you think about things as like the doing versus things as like English would have you think based around nouns, English gets you to think more of like yourself and individualistically, I guess. But a language that gets you to think about movements and how things are connected, and how are you going to go in like that way, then it gets you to think about the connection that you have to the world. And I find that that's one thing that I like to bring up when I'm talking with folks, and especially talking about folks in relation to the land. So I had shared this with Daniel, and I'm sharing it with you now as well, as a way to also encourage you to kind of think about your language, and maybe does your language have a way that would have encouraged you to think differently and have a different worldview and connection to the world. So we were walking along this concrete path, and it was like winter, so it wasn't exactly the most comfortable walk. But I think too, we've kind of gotten too used to comfort, and comfort has made it easier for us as humans to kind of like take a step back and not be present with the things around us. And for me, that was very clear after Daniel fell and I fell slipping on ice. So we were walking on concrete makes it very easy for us to kind of just be like, oh yeah, we're walking. But when you factor in ice, it brings a realization to your head to be like, oh wait, I gotta watch where I step so that I don't slip. And that kind of awareness, we didn't like, I think it took us a little bit to pick up on it, that like we were connecting with the land and thinking about how we connected with the land, because of this ice and not wanting to fall. So that was very interesting for us to talk about. And then we continued on our walk, and we went under the 401, which for me was a very, very interesting experience. I wasn't the most fond of it, and it was very interesting because we had been surrounded by trees and by this lake, and there was a bunch of snow, and it looked very pretty. And then we got under the 401, and it was like rocks and barren and not very, you couldn't see very much life under, and it wasn't a very big patch of our walk either. It was a very small, but the contrast was very present in my eyes. And so that was interesting. And then we also got to thinking about how like there were cars driving above us and you could hear them very clearly, and they drowned out any of the other sounds that we had heard throughout the walk so far. And so these cars, we were thinking about them. We took a break under this highway, and we started talking about like, oh yeah, cars. Well, what do cars kind of like mean for travel and mean for movement, and the relation of like what we were talking about and why we were together. And so one kind of conclusion that we came to was that cars make it easier for folks to kind of connect with the land in ways that they might not be able to now due to urbanization. And then it also kind of takes away from the experience of that like walking the land kind of has. And so that was interesting, and it made us think and as well how concrete is like a physical layer that separates us and our feet from the soil that is so full of life. So those are some thoughts that we had, and then also talking about or thinking about like I had mentioned the cars that had like been kind of drowning out the sounds. One of those sounds that we had picked up on was a white-throated sparrow, which for me has been a sound that has kind of followed me wherever I've gone. I hear it back home in Garden River, and I've heard it growing up in Hamilton. And my aunt, you might hear one of these sounds in about 10-ish minutes. If I'm talking, but my aunt has a clock that has bird sounds on it, and one of those bird sounds is a white-throated sparrow. So when I heard this sound while we were doing our walk, I was like, oh, hey, like that sounds like home. And so that was a very interesting thing for myself. And I'll pass it back to Daniel to continue talking about movement.
Just thought I'd throw some bird sounds into the presentation. Sorry to interrupt you, Shyler.
No worries.
But yeah, it's amazing how sound can be so transportative and also indicative of like, yeah, what does home mean? And often I've traveled to, I've been lucky enough to travel to Europe, and I look up in the sky and I still see Orion, the constellation, and that's like a signal of home. So there are all these ways of connecting, but it's just so transportative. Another element is like the smell, and now that the snow has thawed and the warm weather has come, maybe a little too fast, but I think we all welcome it. That smell of the ravines is so distinct, and it's like, of course, a smell that is involved, like human elements are involved in it, and there's like pollution and gas and effluence and the greenery, and just that Toronto ravine smell is so transportative. And it wasn't I very intentionally wanted to bring Shyler and I to the 401 as part of our walk, because I wanted us to go like to a place where water needed the most love, and needed the most attention, and that kind of motivates me a lot. It's the way my friend put it once was how to love a landfill. Like a landfill is worthy of love, and there's so many narratives about this land that it's been polluted and ruined, and it's not interesting. It's there, there's not like the mountains like the British Columbia. It's not as beautiful, and I just try and resist that narrative so much, because I'm like, who's telling me that? Who's pushing that narrative that this land is not worthy of our love and attention? And the 401 especially, it's the busiest highway in North America, which is not a great thing to have to win the trophy for. But so many people spend hours of their life on the 401, 3 hours a day, maybe, going back and forth to work. And, we need to look very closely to the places that we are inclined to look away from, because I think the first thing to do is to acknowledge that that there are places in this land that need our love and attention. And so it was really important to bring Shyler there and be there with as part of this project. And it was hard. It was definitely hard to look at, because it's a river system that has been very poorly treated. Yeah, and the highway itself, as kind of marking human movement. So we talked about the Carrying Place Trail, but I have often read in various books and heard in various talks, like the highways are kind of like the contemporary manifestations of ancient walkways that have defined this land for millennia. So, you know, we have the Gardiner Expressway today, but people have been walking along the lakeshore for tens and hundreds of thousands of years. We have the 400 now that goes up to Barrie, but that's kind of the like contemporary expression of the Carrying Place Trail. It's like movement and intention, and not to be apathetic about all the negative effects of cars, but just trying to find the humanity that is sometimes we're told is not there is important. So on our second walk, Shyler and I went to follow the Carrying Place Trail, and I picked Shyler up from Mimico GO station. And we started, even though it's not in North York technically, we started at the mouth of the trailhead of the Carrying Place Trail, which, if you know Toronto's land history, like where the lake is now is not where the lake was 200 years ago. There's been a lot of fill. So the trailhead, where the mouth of the Humber Cobochanock River used to be, is now kind of marooned inland. And Toronto is a funny place, and I think it comes from the violence of colonization and just like not being able to look at our own history. But there feels like there's a lot of amnesia because and people can't remember the most important things. Because I would say, I've thought about this a lot, and I'm welcome to have a debate or, you know, have a conversation about this, that the most important site in Toronto is the trailhead of the Carrying Place Trail. It's like why humans have gathered here. It marks so many layers of history and many nations and trade and cultural exchange and connection, and yet it is completely invisible in the landscape. Only, you know, so many people know that it exists. Only so many people could kind of trace it. And at the trailhead, what I'm saying is the most important site in the history of the city and this region is marked by a gas station. Not even a gas station, it's like the back of a gas station. There's no signage. Shyler and I stopped at the side of the road. Kind of, you know, there was one sign that's kind of referenced it, but it's not even close to where the trailhead was. And there's these informal pathways. There's so much barriers to connecting with the water itself. So that, you know, I think is really interesting in showing where we're at in terms of connecting with where we've come from and the land itself. So because, you know, I have a car and we were going a far distance, we were driving. So we drove the Carrying Place Trail, which is very 2022. And we started from the trailhead, and Shyler and I discussed, like what whiteness means and what disconnection from land means. And one thing that stuck with me from that is like relating to things as resources to be used is kind of like something that is, you know, characterizes the relationship with land from Europe and of course that's part of the relationship with land in Turtle Island, but it's not the whole thing. And I remember Shyler saying that, you know, there's like, you know, you shouldn't dig a certain amount down because that's like disruptive. And Shyler, let me know if I'm remembering this incorrectly.
Yeah, it's like I think it's like 6 feet down you're not supposed to dig past. Just like as far as you can find copper. And if you dig past further, then it's like bad medicine kind of things. Yeah.
And then just thinking about the tar sands and the oil sands and all that in relation. So there's just a moment of, you know, like mourning and grief that comes with kind of getting close to the landscape at this point. But then, you know, we took the car up Riverside Drive, and we're still in Toronto, Etobicoke. And there's actually very miraculously an ancient tree grove that is still existing in the roadway. And these would have been the oaks that line the Carrying Place Trail. Today, they're on the front lawns of mansions, but they're still there. So it's called the Oh, Wendy, I believe you're not on mute unless you want to say something. I'll just carry on. So yeah, there's this ancient tree grove, and for those of you familiar with Toronto, Weston Road, it's one of these streets that doesn't follow the grid. It's kind of bendy, and much of Weston Road actually follows the Carrying Place Trail. So next time you're stuck in traffic on Weston Road, just know that you're connecting with deep history. So I'll share again my screen. So I just wanted to share with you the maps of the Carrying Place Trail. So, this is the Rouge, Don, Humber, and Toronto today, and the trail would have followed the Humber, but then this is where the Oak Ridges Moraine is, where the sources of these rivers are. And then it would have kind of followed to what's now known as the Holland River up to what's now known as Lake Simcoe, and this is where the Takaranto is, at the narrows between Lake Couchiching and Simcoe. And then just a closer look at the Carrying Place Trail through Toronto. So this is kind of the marker, the trailhead, and then we passed by what's known as Tyagon, which was a very large Haudenosaunee village, and they had farms and longhouses, and there's lots of archaeological evidence of that. And we took it all the way up to the oldest tree in Toronto. So this was kind of our driving route. Yeah. Let me just return to my speaking notes. So what was interesting was, so we went to the oldest tree in Toronto, which is preserved red oak tree. That's there's this bungalow, and behind it is this giant oak tree, and it's quite inaccessible. Schuyler had kind of commented on the fact that it was kind of hard to find our way there. But then after visiting the Carrying Place Trail and visiting the tree, I drove Schuyler back to the train station, and in order to get back to the Mimico GO station, the quickest way was to take the highways all the way, the 401 to the 427 to the Gardiner, and kind of going so far away. So we had just done this kind of slow contemplative route following the water and connecting, but it was so inefficient when it comes to the city and get it going from A to B. And the logic of the highways brought us really far, but it was actually faster. So that was kind of a moment where we meditated on the fact that getting from A to B as fast as possible is something that disconnects us. And Schuyler kind of noted that, visiting Toronto, it's kind of, you can feel people are really destination oriented and not journey oriented. So just shifting slightly, I already talked a bit about the names of the Don and the Humber, Cobochanock and Wascontenash. And we also kind of found our way looking at many plants, and I'm a lifelong learner. Expertise is not my end game in terms of knowing wild plants, but it's a really interesting way to connect with the landscape. And there's this thing that there was a time in Toronto managing the ravines where the city official said, you know what, no human should go in there, they're wild, let's let them go. And a lot of quote unquote invasive species then started to kind of take over and take resources from the other plants, and eroding cliffs. And it was, there's something in there where when there was a lack of human intervention, the environment went out of balance. And it goes back to that idea that when Europeans came to Turtle Island, what they saw and interpreted as wilderness was actually carefully cultivated landscapes by indigenous nations. And they couldn't read it in the same, they were looking for European agriculture, but it looked different here. And so when humans aren't participating in the ecology, that goes out of balance. So it's a very healing thought to remind ourselves that we belong on this earth and that we are part of ecosystems. And invasive species, calling a whole species like dog strangling vine or knotweed or even dandelions, calling a living being invasive is very dismissive of that being, and kind of doesn't it avoids us looking at ourselves, which I think, a plant, there's nothing wrong with a plant. It's, are we disrupting the environment enough for one plant to take over versus another plant? Like, we need to contribute to the balance. So I'll pass it to you, Shyler.
Yeah, thank you. And so we had kind of shifted a bit into like talking about like remembrance of, and like how do we remember land and our connection to land, and how also has like colonization affected the ways that we relate to that concept. So colonization would have us think about land as this, as like other. It's like it has no relationship to us. We are able to take from it and use it as they please because it has no feelings. But the land does have feelings, and I think the land very much does like love interacting with us and having us interact with it. And so when we were walking, and also when we were walking and traveling through Toronto and North York in particular, this was a big thing, as Daniel touched on, and it was like Toronto wouldn't, the like city of Toronto wouldn't mark some place as important as the Carrying Place Trail, because if it did, then it would have to acknowledge how important land was, and a city doesn't want to do that. So so that was interesting. And also in like talking about the oldest tree in Toronto, it was inaccessible. It was behind someone's house on owned property. And also in like this neighborhood that this house lived in, there were no sidewalks. So I grew up very much like my family didn't own a car until I was like 17. And so like sidewalks are like something that like were very important to me. And to see a place that like to be in a place that didn't have sidewalks, it was kind of like, what, like these people here don't walk, and surely they must walk, but it just wasn't within their infrastructure to build these sidewalks. And so in a similar way, I hope folks are noticing that like a big thing that we noticed, and like it was all these small pieces that kind of just brought to light how like kind of irrelevant the land is and kind of has become because of colonization. So a big part of like what I hope you take away from this conversation is just to like connect with the land and connect with the water, and think about how you and your ancestors have come into this space and come onto this land, and how that influences how you are coming into spaces, because it is not, there are spaces for all of us to exist here together, but I don't believe that they're all going to be the same, and I strongly don't believe that they should remain the same as they are now. So and like thinking about like relationships to like the land and the water, I had talked a bit about earlier about how home to me sounds like white-throated sparrows, and one thing that I noted and would love to share with you is that home to me also kind of looks like light dancing off the water, and that was one thing that I noticed when on our second walk at the Humber, was when Daniel and I went there, was the light always reflects off the water in the same way, because a lot of the times the water has similar patterns, and so it's always like comforting that no matter where we are in the world, there are specific things that remind us of home, and it reminds us as well that we as humans, and also as quite as like often as displaced Indigenous peoples, because we are all Indigenous to somewhere, but that indigeneity definitely looks different and has like different yeah, it's very different, but we are all Indigenous to somewhere. So just like recognizing those, and we do have connections to the land that should be honored. But yeah, I think I was getting a bit off track, but yeah, I'll pass it back to Daniel to talk about water.
Yeah, so I think, we spent time on the land, we spent time on Zoom talking about our time on the land. And I think that water and movement became quite central to our experience. It was something that we were naturally attracted to, and that's because we're human and that's because we live on this land. So we were given the task of kind of investigating North York. We wanted to do so through our experiences. And, like I said earlier, that land and its relationship with water as being kind of between the source and the destination, Lake Ontario, before it goes into the wider ocean, is an important moment. And the history of this land has brought the humans away from the water, and we want to use this project as an opportunity to invite relationship with water, to bring people back to the rivers, to bring rivers back into the consciousness of the identity of this place. And because we all have that relationship with water, and it's, learning about Anishinaabe, and Schuyler's experiences growing up really helped me connect with the tradition of water in this land. And I really appreciated it at that. So maybe to close, we'll, offer a question about what's your personal connection with water? What's the water that you connect with most? Please join the conversation. And, when you close your eyes and Schuyler guided us through that meditation, where did it bring you? And what's your relationship like? And how can it be better? And do other people know about it? And do you want to be there more? So thank you. Miigwech. Yahweh.
Yeah, thank you for joining us tonight. And yeah, we do have about 20 minutes left to kind of talk, and if you have any questions for us specifically, and also if you want to genuinely feel free to answer that question that Daniel had posed, it can be in the chat, or if you want to unmute, go ahead. We'd also love to see your faces so thank you so much for listening to us. I hope the storytelling was warmed your heart. So Miigwech.
So we have a message from Pearl, Pearl Sesqueira, saying, water, my childhood was in Arabian Sea. Now I'm a resident in North York, New Tombrook Creek, my favorite morning ritual. That's amazing. Lindsay's on the road. Be careful. Hopefully you will find some water, Lindsay. And I would like to share, I love water. I am from Colombia, and I started learning how to swim when I was 4 years old. And I consider myself like a little mermaid, more like a whale now. But I love water, and it's very important for me. And also, when I moved to Canada, I was living in London, Ontario, and I noticed that, and I had this conversation before with Daniel as well, which is I noticed that the rivers were very shallow and they were not that big, and I wasn't used to seeing these huge rivers, and you could hear the sound of the water hitting the rocks and all of this. But when I moved to Toronto, I realized there are not many rivers are super big and this way, but still they are there. And then Daniel, in one of the walks that we did for another project, he mentioned these things about the water. So for me, water is so important, especially they said we are swimming in water when we are in our mother's wombs as well. So we're always surrounded by water. And I'm always kind of remind myself something that Veronica Johnny, consultant for many other projects of the organization with North York, is if you cannot get close to nature, because last year and the previous year, because of the pandemic, people were afraid of going out, at least drink water and feel that connection. And also some folks have mentioned about talking to the water. And there are some proofs about how when you talk to the water, and it crystallizes. And if you have said positive things, it will be one way. And if you have said negative things, it will change also the way it is. So yes, I just love water. It's fascinating. And thank you. And Christina is sharing. Would you like to talk, Christina? Or would you like us to read what you have?
Yeah, I'll come on camera and talk because I do feel a little bit odd talking and not seeing myself. But yeah, I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, Vancouver, BC, as well as Portland, Oregon, and a little bit of time actually in San Francisco. And so my relationship to water is very intertwined with growing up, and spent a lot of time at the beach in both elementary school and high school. And Tyler, you asked, like, do I want to spend more, or I think Daniel, you asked, do I want to spend more time there? I don't ever want to move back to Vancouver. It's not a city that feels good in my body, nor my body feels good in that city. But when I do visit my family, I always go back to those same beaches that I spent time at as a kid, and like definitely feel connected to the youthful and like child sides of me. And yeah, I hadn't spent enough time finding a relationship to water in Ontario and Toronto. Daniel, you mentioned everyone in Toronto is like destination oriented, and that really has been my pace of life for 10 years. And I think what I've learned, in especially these last few sessions, is I do have a like untapped desire to like root my body and my existence more in the land that I'm currently living in, and the land that I do want to spend at least the next couple of years of my life living and working in.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, it's interesting to hear, the cities of the Pacific Northwest are not where you feel comfortable, but that landscape is. So to me, there's like that distortion and, the city as an environment that takes us away from like those natural cues. And what's nice about Toronto is there's kind of like, somebody put it this way to me, a teacher of mine said, like, in many cities there are hard edges between nature and the city if we're going to divide the two, but in Toronto there's soft edges. So yes, our rivers aren't like in Colombia, like the big giant ones, but at least they're kind of like, the thing about the ravine system is it's kind of everywhere. And I joke with people like, I grew up here hanging out in the ravines as a wayward teen, and anyone who's grown up in Toronto has the same stories, like, but a different ravine. So, like, what's your childhood ravine is like, where'd you go to high school? Where'd you hang out? And so, while as Toronto is like the big concrete jungle, I would encourage everyone to kind of soften your eyes and look past the narratives that we have of this place, and to, the invitation of these sessions, and really grateful to contribute to that, to kind of like find the, follow the water, find the water. And as Pearl mentioned, Newton Brook Creek, that's a beautiful spot in North York, and we're always close by here.
There are some responses that we got in the chat as well. One from Natalia sharing that they came from a country of hills and tropical weather, so thinking about water takes them back to waterfalls and heavy rain. So I really love that connection of like how thinking about water brought you back home, if that's how you feel about that. But yeah, brought you back home. And so thank you for sharing that. And I could like just imagine it, and I was like, oh, it feels so lovely to think about that. And we also got a response from Melissa. I have always felt at home in the lakes in Ontario. I grew up swimming in them, and it is where I feel most grounded, like surrounded by trees, even better. Yeah. Me as well. I have grew up kind of by Hamilton Harbor, and but back home in Garden River, it's like there's a lake by my grandma's house, and it's one of those lakes surrounded by trees. So I really resonate with that. Thank you both for sharing.
I wanted to mention something, and is that something that I have to acknowledge and I appreciate about the lakes and the rivers here in Ontario or in Canada is that before back home, when I was growing up, or when I go and visit, now we have less rivers that we can swim in because of contamination, pollution. So it's really interesting because something to appreciate. And I know, of course, we have issues as well because we're talking about the water and not drinkable water is available for many indigenous communities in the country. But it was really interesting and something that I appreciate is like it's not that bad. The contamination, the pollution in the rivers in Ontario. So uh, having access not only to drink the water, but uh, being in the water, is, and I don't know, this might sound crazy for some people, but the way that I feel is like that sensation. Every human should have the right to swim in the water and to experience the water and to be taken by the journey that just water can take you into, like, and you feel when it's drying in your body, when it's absorbed by your skin, and when you can feel in some countries and in some rivers and lakes in Canada and everywhere, because of the minerals, the water might be heavier than in the others, and it's just so amazing that I just wanted to mention that. And Tanya, you had a question, and I love to see all those cameras on. Hello, Pearl and Melissa and Julius, of course. Yes, Tanya, go ahead, please. We cannot hear you. Tanya. Yeah, there you go. Go ahead.
Hi, you able to hear me now?
Yes, we are.
Okay. I am learning Anishinaabemowin as well. So I wanted to first share Buju Indinawe Maganaduk, Tanya King Indigenous Cause, Anishinaabe Kwe, Giche Kiwaning and Dayan, Chimnising Nukmas Injaba. And yeah, so I've shared hello, all my relatives. My name is Tanya. I'm an Ojibwe woman. Toronto is where I'm from. I was born here. And Chimnising, which is colonially, known as Beausoleil First Nation, is where my grandmother was born. And yeah, so I just wanted to say that I grew up here, so going to Q Beach, Lake Ontario was sort of the water, but my home community is in Georgian Bay. Like that's where our First Nations located. It's the southern tip of Georgian Bay, and it's so beautiful there. I rarely get to go there. I've only been there a handful of times. Because growing up here, I never bothered to get a license. It's impossible in the city. If you really actually live here, it's impossible to have a vehicle. I've always thought. Certainly in terms of cost, but in any case, so that's the waters I wanted to share. And thank you both for the discussion. I do also want to say that I agree 100% that this is definitely a destination location. I've struggled with that for a while, actually, that I try to consider my surroundings and take that in when I go out for a walk or go out to go somewhere, and I find I just fall back into my regular habit of just relentlessly focusing on the destination and not the journey. And so that is something I'm trying to change, but after 46 Baboonese, it's a little hard.
Thank you so much
Thank
for sharing, Tanya.
Which
I think it's also like be gentle with yourself as well. It's not I think the world that we live in right now, it doesn't accommodate paying attention to your surroundings very much. So yeah, I think even like just that awareness is very powerful. So thank you for sharing.
And Pearl, you had a comment as well. Would you like to talk about your comment on the chat, Pearl?
Sure. So I actually grew up in the United Arab Emirates, and I grew up at a time when, so it was in this, like the early 80s, and it's not what it is today. And one of the things we had was just access to the beaches, access to the mountains, access to the wadis, which are dry lake beds. And you get two types. You get the ones which are really flat, and you get the other ones which are pools, but the pools can be dangerous, and that people can die in it when there's a flash flood. And I've actually had friends die in it because of a flash flood. And so I always think about water in that sense, about it's not a force to be messed with. There's something about the force. It's like it can be gentle, and it can also come from nowhere and just really pull you under. So I think there's a lot of value in respecting water and what water brings to space, and with that balance, like what is balance? And so yeah, so I've been walking to Newtonbrook Creek. It takes me about 15 minutes to walk every morning. And one of the things that I do consistently is I actually walk bare feet into the creek, and it's actually quite dicey at times, and it's actually flat, but because the rocks and everything, and I have to consistently be present with myself so I don't have a fall or anything. And yet it's also been a space when I've been dealing with some really difficult times where I can just go there and find myself. And when I don't spend time there, that's when I go, oh my gosh, I need to go back there again.
Thank you for sharing. The wadis in UAE sounds like similar to the waterways here, in that people they misunderestimate them, because the rivers here are little, but they can be big, and like understanding them and being respectful and humble is part of our relationship with the water. So even though they're little now, we have to, they'll be big when it rains a lot. So it's interesting, and I even love the word body, like just like that idea, and how the different parts of the world have these kind of very specific geographic phenomenon that you can develop relationships with. So I like to think, like, the word ravine is very associated with Toronto, and it's, over the last few years, people have thought of us as a ravine city. So Julian, in your work with North York Arts, the ravines and the water as the signposts to understanding the place are really important.
Yeah, I'm going to share with all of you a link. So I was looking for a map of the Lost Rivers in Toronto, and it was difficult. We couldn't find any, but I found a website. I'm going to put it on the chat in a second, that shows you some of the places where we used to have rivers, body of rivers that we don't have any longer. I will put that on the chat for you to, whenever you want to see it. Enough that.
Yeah, so we're coming up on like the last 5 minutes of our time together, and I just wanted to thank you all so much for sharing your reflections and sharing your voices with us. I find that